we have 3 movies this week. 2 that came out today, and 1 that came out like a couple of weeks ago. That only just came around here. So this is basically the weekend of movies that kind of went in a totally different direction than expectations, because when it comes September, usually that's about the time we start getting award season movies. And this isn't exactly the way I don't think any of us thought about it when we saw the Goldfinch and Hustlers coming out the same day, and it's like, one of these is going to be an awards contender, and one of them probably isn't going to be. And you would have thought the actual reverse. It was almost like there was a glitch in Rotten Tomatoes or something when you saw the 2 scores. Like one was they're supposed to be, one was supposed to be with the other, and the other way around. But no, the Goldfinch has opened to dreadful reviews, while Hustlers is being praised up and down, and they're even starting to throw awards buzz at Jennifer Lopez, of all people. Not that she hasn't shown talent before, going all the way back to Selena, but it's just a really bizarre occurrence this weekend. It's almost surreal looking at the reaction of these 2 movies. So needless to say, they made an interesting double feature, I suppose. I'll try to squeeze out any thoughts I can about them. I'm not crazy about anything this week, but that's also what comes with this part of the year. So let's start with the Goldfinch, actually. Despite the fact that it was me and one other person in there. And the reason this one had so much awards was that it is obviously based on a very beloved Pulitzer Prize winning book. It's one of those very simple posters that just has a cast list on it with one image. The director is John Crowley, who did Brooklyn, as in Saoirse Ronan's Brooklyn, the Best Picture nominee and Best Actress nominee. So people just kind of assumed this was a given. And when we did our last awards video, I said that it was giving me Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close vibes. However you want to take that. And I meant that more along as just the vibes it was getting me, but after having seen it, I still kind of feel that way. So if you are one of the few people that's not in the Academy but did like Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, you might be okay with this. I read like half of the book, the first half of it. It was one of those cases where like I read half of it and then it was due back at the library, so I took it back, and then I just kind of didn't have enough interest to go back for it. But watching this again, because the adaptation is so bizarrely faithful, what I did read came back to me in massive doses, like all at once. Because it's literally like they just picked up the book and just threw it onto a screen in its exact form. The only thing they've really changed here, which I think is something that does the movie in, is the structure. But because starting with that, if you are going into it as a book reader, there are some things that you may notice right away that kind of almost, like, they sort of betray it in a way where they almost put it exactly as is on the screen, but then there's some stuff missing, and it's probably usually going to be the best stuff. One of the scenes in the book that really always stood out to me in this really harrowing way is the scene when he leaves the museum and goes back to the apartment and just waits for his mom all night. And it gets more and more, we kind of come to accept that the worst may have happened the more and more he waits, and the whole, how descriptive it gets about how he hears people coming home from work in the other apartments, and then after a while they've gone to bed, just to show how much time is passing and he still doesn't know anything. Which I think would make a great scene on screen, but they just skip right over it. And it doesn't even start with the museum scene either. We get the opening scene, like we do in the book, of him as a more or less adult, when he's Ansel Elgort in the movie. And then it just jumps forward to the museum has already happened, and Nicole Kidman is here saying she'll take him in. And it's right then where it's like, you feel like, oh, okay, so they've put it here, but the stuff they're going to take out I think is really going to affect this in a bad way. So what they've basically done is taken the more tedious aspects of it, the tedious aspects, which were the reason I didn't feel like I was in a hurry to finish the book, are all here in their glory. Stuff like Jeffrey Wright going into all the details of what he does in the antique shop. The stuff that's much more at home in a novel than it would be in, say, dialogue in a movie. But that's not to say that like Jeffrey Wright is like the perfect casting choice for Herbie, especially since he's got like even when he's describing this stuff that's like really super tedious, if he's still just like it's the perfect idea to get an actor as magnetic as Jeffrey Wright and as soft spoken, and it's like so those scenes he's still able to carry those scenes, but you can't help but think there are other scenes in the book that could be in the place of this kind of stuff, or they could show the bond between. Hobie and Theo a bit more cinematically than this, but yeah, but not necessarily. You can do that without betraying the material too, I think. But this movie didn't seem to want to take any risks about changing much adaptation wise, except for the structure. I feel like I'm glad I started to remember what I had read of the book when I went into this, because I feel like people who go in not having read the book, the structure might be really confusing with the way they introduce stuff with no context, and we don't get that context till like much later, and the pieces you would think there'd be context clues there to like really figure it out. Not really, or at least not very strong ones. Like I said, it's hard for me to gauge, having known at least what the first half of the book is, and knowing what it was I was seeing, even if the movie wasn't really... It's almost like the movie is relying on the audience being entirely people that read the book, which isn't always the way to go. Because, like I said, even if you go in having read the book and maybe you even love the book, there's still going to be something I think totally underwhelming about this. But like I said, it is weird how like I was starting to remember like all of the very specific descriptions just watching the movie because of how much they brought from the book, like the all the way down to Fiddler's Room having the Wizard of Oz poster. And it's like that's probably something I never would have remembered from the book. And then the second I saw that, I was like, yeah, that was like specifically mentioned in the book. So you can see, even then, without any further examples, you can probably see just right there how on paper this might seem like a good idea, but then when you actually see it translated, it's like there is sometimes a problem with being a bit too literal in adaptation. And I think this movie is going to be like probably one of the prime examples of that as we go on. But I mean, still, one thing that does help it stay afloat is the casting is pretty much... In fact, well, I talked about Jeffrey Wright, and then there's Oaks who was Pete in the Pete's Dragon remake, who grows up in Ansel Elgort, as we know. Sarah Paulson is the perfect Xandra, and then there's Luke Wilson as a case where he might seem like an odd choice when you hear it, but when you think about the way his dad has that way about him, where it's like, I think he describes it in the book to where it's like he always had a way of charming people. Like he's a piece of shit. He's an absolute piece of shit. But there's something about him to where he can just he seems like a nice guy to everybody that doesn't know him, and he can charm people out of shit with that. And it's like, yeah, I can totally buy Luke Wilson being able to charm people and get that vibe, but it's just a matter of if he's going to be able to play the piece of shit side. And yeah, it might seem like it might be a stretch when you think about it, but to actually see what he does, and the way we can see how his personality can just change like a switch at any second. The scene in the book, when he gets him on the phone with the lawyer and basically tries to get him to get the $65,000, is very much in the movie. I was wondering if it would be or not. That was the scene that really stood out to me. It's like, oh, this is like really showing exactly who his dad actually is. And yeah, it's intense because of the way Wilson's able to play he starts the scene with, "Hey, buddy, how's it going? You think you could help me out with something?" To him slapping him 3 times with no fucking remorse whatsoever. And he's actually convincing. It could have been a scene that was like felt like way over the top or way too exaggerated. But there was some sort of realism that Wilson was actually able to bring into the way his personality's changed as the scene went. So that they were to pull that off does it a lot of favors. And then there is Finn Wolfhard, who I had heard that there were some, like when the trailers came out, there were criticisms about his accent. But as I've said countless times before, accents aren't usually something that I really think about that much, because I don't know if I know enough about them to even judge them. But it is like, can you really judge the accent of a character like Boris, who's just from so many places? Like, it's, I mean, you can pinpoint like maybe one accent he's doing, but this is a dude that's literally lived everywhere in the short amount of time he's been on Earth. If his accent's like a whole fucked up hodgepodge of like 20 different ones, that would make sense to an extent. So I don't really think there was much he could do that would go way off of that, really. Um, and then of course Kidman. I do think that there is one thing that kind of goes against the book here, at least from what I remember, which was that Mrs. Barber's supposed to be like really sort of like cold and distant, which is something Kidman could totally do. And when I heard about her casting, it was like, yeah, I could see that. But it's like she could really play that well. But here it's almost like it's a lot like her performance in Lion to me, which if you remember is actually like a real like the total opposite of cold. Like there's just an inherent warmth to it, and there's like a comfort to her throughout. So I thought that was kind of if you're expecting more along the lines of the cold thing, I don't think that's really what was going on here. And if that was her attempt at cold, she didn't get very far with it. But I'm gonna guess it was probably their intention in the sort of writing and directing phase to change her to a slightly warmer presence, especially to contrast with when he goes off with his dad, Xander. So that would make sense either way, even if it kind of goes against the book a little bit. So it does use its settings pretty well. Once again, talking about those contrasts, where once we get to Luke Wilson's house out in the desert, and it does feel like when Sarah Paulson says like we are the only ones out here, and then he goes outside to take the trash out, and it does feel like it's eerie how isolated it feels. And so stuff like that I do think comes through, and I did hear, even despite the bad reviews, apparently something a lot of people are talking about positively is the way that it's shot, which works also. But then at the same time, it is still like it is really well shot, yet they've somehow still managed to make it pretty lifeless. It's a really weird combination. It's kind of a weird movie when you see the different combinations here of the things that totally should have worked and the ways that they fail. And it's like it's just kind of a back and forth where it's like just when you think it's catching on and you're like, okay, so if they just stay on this, then I think we'll be okay, and then it does something else. And then, like I said, the timeline with the way it's cutting back and forth. Because one of the things I did, like, that I found the most engrossing, I think, about what I read of the book was the friendship between him and Boris. And that was another one of those cases where it was like, the accent be damned. Once I heard that Finn Wolfhard was going to be playing Boris, it just kind of was like, yeah, I buy that, like, instantly, just imagining it. And it's pretty much looks on screen exactly as you would imagine it. And their whole friendship and all the trouble they got into, where it's like that could have been a whole story in itself, is the Theo and Boris friendship when they're kids. But before we even get to that, the movie's doing the fractured timeline thing where we go back and forth between him as a child and then him when he's working with Hobie and he's doing the whole, selling fakes thing. And then there's the subplot with Dennis O'Hare coming in. And Dennis O'Hare feels like he's like and this is another problem with the bouncing back and forth thing, is Dennis O'Hare feels like the villain in a totally different movie when he shows up in this, and it's like really jarring. So I don't, just so tonally, it kind of felt like we were going back and forth. Like if it was just in chronological order and the second half took that tone, if they got there gradually, I think there'd be something there. But the fact that you can't really do anything gradually when you're bouncing back and forth in the timeline with two totally different portions of Theo's life going on in those moments. Like, they don't mirror each other in any way whatsoever. Like, I could see you doing that if that was the case. Where it's like, well, this thing in his childhood directly reflected on, this that happened in his early adulthood, but not really. It's just sort of jumping back and forth because it doesn't seem to want to stay on one thing too long. And being a 2.5 hour movie, that's gonna really fuck up your pacing, really bad. So, yeah. So, and then like that's another thing that's done in is when he goes back to the barbers, which is him going back to New York and back to Hobie's is where I left off in the book. So everything after that was new to me. Which was confusing because it's bouncing back and forth between stuff I knew and stuff I didn't. So I don't even know if half this stuff is even in the book. But I'm going to assume with the way everything else is adapted, it probably is faithfully. So, but the whole thing about him going back to the barbers, and Kidman being much older and the kids being grown-ups, and they're all like, "Oh my God, you've been away for so long. We can't believe you're here. Oh my God, the years that have passed." And it's like in the movie, no years have passed. Because this scene follows a scene from his childhood because of the way the timeline's edited. So we're not feeling that time at all. We're not feeling those years gone by at all whatsoever. Which I think would have been the heart of the scenes like this if that were the case. But no, the time I had to go and mess them up. So that's... yeah. So it's almost like it's actively doing like a self-sabotage thing, where it's like everything here could have worked. The groundwork was here, but it was just just the way everything's put together and the way they decided to tell the story just keeps shooting itself in the foot, really. And there is something, and this obviously goes to the story itself and not just the movie. But now that I know where the rest of the story goes, since I didn't finish the book, I started coming to terms with the fact that I'm not really much about this whole Pippa storyline. Nor can I really put together what the point of it is. Obviously, she's crucial at the start of his life because she's what separated him from his mother. But I mean, apart from that, what they do with it and the directions it goes, you can pretty much take her out of the story and nothing really changes, at least as far as I remember. So I don't really know. And the fact, and the whole storyline of him being obsessed with her just doesn't really ring true to me. Like it's almost too sudden, and like it's one thing that it's too sudden. It's another thing that it's sudden. They devote so much time to it, and then it doesn't go anywhere. So I don't even know. I'm not even sure how to take that. I mean, yeah, she's the connection to Hobie and everything, who's much more crucial in his life. I don't know if he realizes that yet, but still, it's, yeah. So it's something else that made that book a little longer than it needed to be, and certainly made this movie a little longer than it needs to be. So, yeah, so I mean, there is stuff like the scenes with Boris when they're kids do add a liveliness to the movie, as you would expect if you read those scenes in the book, but there's also the moments where it's like, you can tell it's like a prestige project. There will be moments where it seems like the movie just flat out goes into misery porn from time to time, which can get really tiresome and not in the good, effective way. So, yeah, so like the potential's here and you can see it. I think one of the headlines it made was, I think there was a major critic, I don't even know what a major critic would be anymore, but when you see what they are now. But one critic had actually declared it the worst movie of the year or something. I'm not really sure where that comes from. There must be a lot of movies that person missed this year. But yeah, the fact that you can see the potential in it, whether it be the way that it's shot, or the casting, or a lot of the performances. Yeah, I also am kind of glad I didn't waste my time finishing the book, if that's what the ending was. Like, the whole sort of last 15 minutes or so is like, it just seems like a very sort of tacked on way to go, and like I said, just adds a sort of, like, the tone is just so, just all over the damn place. So I don't know, like what I was talking about earlier about even if it was in chronological order, if they could have gradually gotten there, I'm not totally sure you can gradually get to that last 15 minutes, starting where we start. So I don't know. So yeah, some of it seems to be my problems with the story itself. But a lot of the times the movie wasn't doing it any favors either. But there is some stuff in there that's worthwhile. So, and if there are people that love the book enough, I'm sure they'll take to it just fine. But I'm just sort of, yeah, there it is. Another failed prestige movie, and that'll be it. Unless it goes the extreme loud, incredibly close route, and it doesn't even matter if people hate it; it'll still happen. But I'm gonna say probably not. But speaking of, let's go on to Hustlers, which is at first it seems like, oh, it's this sort of like with the whole female empowerment thing, yet somehow still a Magic Mike movie in a sense. It's what it looks like on the surface. But then and I heard, it was, obviously I don't watch the trailers, but I hear them, and this trailer was on Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, so I heard this trailer a lot. So I still recognize some of the scenes while still seeing them for the first time. And yeah, that's basically just what I heard, got the vibe of. And then it was only recently I had learned the whole true story angle. And then when the movie starts, and the whole, them establishing that it's a true story, I was kind of surprised by how, like, bleak it felt. Like, they were gonna, like, not only was it based on a true story, but they were actually gonna take that true story seriously, regardless of what seemed to be the subject matter of the movie, setting itself up to be, like, a comedy, basically. Which, in a sense, it is. But the thing is the interesting thing, though, is me saying that, when it starts off saying it's a true story and it kind of has a bleak feel to it, then when we see the introduction, there's an interesting contrast to kind of show us how that sort of progression we know from most true story movies like this, or especially in such a flashy environment, is it's going to start off extremely flashy and like really lively. There's like this really wild energy to it that doesn't let up for a long time. The characters are all like these really big personalities, these really exaggerated personalities, and it's like you can just tell that it's like as lively and energetic as possible, because eventually it's likely going to go downhill for a lot of the characters in this, and it's almost like the more lively it gets, the more you can feel the downfall being set up, and the way that sort of sets up kind of a almost subtle bleakness to it, I think, is pretty effective. And our two main characters here being Constance Wu and Jennifer Lopez, with Constance Wu kind of being the one that does this because she has to. She's the one with like the big arc where she starts off one thing, then by the end is pretty much a totally different one, and that's because she falls under the wing, almost literally, she falls under the fur coat of Jennifer Lopez. And yeah, much to my surprise, as I'm sure many others, people started throwing the word Oscar buzz at Jennifer Lopez after the movie and the reviews started being seen. And it is a relatively meaty part. Like, it's not one of those cases where she has like some big emotional scenes. It's not that kind of part. But the fact that she's one of those characters where you're never quite sure if she's the protagonist or the antagonist. A protagonist or the antagonist. How her sort of, not too dissimilar to what we were talking about with Luke Wilson before, the way she's kind of able to, the character changes her personality through whatever the situation is, which ends up making her a bit unpredictable in effective ways. And while she's usually the kind of character that would be the more kind of character I gravitate towards, where you're never quite sure of like her morality or where she really stands in regards to not just the guys she's actually going after, but the people that are supposedly her friends too. You just have that sort of uncertainty about what direction she's going to go. I am a little surprised that she's getting much more standout notices than Constance Wu, who is clearly the lead of this movie and has, the big arc and has to go from one personality and then gradually go to another, and it's like, while trying to hopefully maintain that side of her, but she's kind of, the more she goes into Lopez territory, the darker she's getting, the more corrupted I guess she's getting. But also the fact that it being a true story obviously being important here. Wu's character feels more like a real person, whereas Lopez's character feels more like a movie character in the way that She just has those traits about her, which, like I said, is, a moot point since it's all supposedly real, but that's the way the characters came through, I thought, to where it almost seems like that you can see them coming from two different places, not just in the movie itself, but in the approach the makers took in portraying them. And yeah, I talked about it being a comedy despite the potentially bleak territory it goes in. There is, it is interesting that it's like, it is funny, but it's kind of funny in unexpected ways at unexpected times, to where it doesn't necessarily feel like a full blown comedy, but like the first part of it feels a lot like the opening setup scenes of something like Set It Off, but then it's eventually going to be like, for lack of a better way to put it, a stripper movie, but then once their plans start coming out and they start doing the horrible things that they do, then it's able to go in those different directions and almost become like a black comedy after a while. That's not to say it's not, and it's clever in the ways that it approaches that, but that's not also to say that it completely avoids the extremely lowbrow. There's a running vomit joke that feels very sort of lazy and lowbrow about itself. But yeah, there is still kind of a balance there, so there is that. And something else you might notice, talking about the liveliness of the movie and the energy I was talking about it has in the opening scenes, is the movie is extremely flashy in the way that it's like shot, and the way it's put together, where there's a lot of long takes. There's a very Goodfellas long take that shows us the entire strip club like in one shot, clearly inspired by that, and also the way they use sound. Is something that like really stands out in the movie and is kind of unique in the way that it does it, to an extent. With that said, those comparisons did have me feeling again pretty much exactly how I felt when I was watching American Hustle, and the things I said after that, where it's like, I like the energy of this, and I like what they're doing with it, and where they're going, and the characters stand out and all that, but it's really hard to separate it from saying it's basically just doing the Scorsese thing. Maybe not quite as blatantly as American Hustle, but pretty close. You got the long takes, the one especially that feels almost identical. Then you got the narration, and the way they play the sound, the framing thing with it being the true story and everything. Yeah, and the fact that it can go from being, energetic and lively like that and funny to an extent, but can also turn dramatic really fast, like really dramatic really fast, depending on what happens, and some of the turns here that happen unexpectedly, or not so unexpectedly. Some of them you can see them being, you can see the blueprints of them very early and the way they're eventually going to pay off, but still, yeah, so, but even despite the whole, it feels a little too much like Scorsese thing, another thing that was kind of holding me back was me talking about the fact that we're going to eventually get to the horrible things that they do. The drugging their clients and robbing them and all that. And of course the movie opens and we get scenes, like we get a really good scene with Frank Whaley and a bunch of other guys that basically show that a lot of these guys who are their clients are basically the scum of the earth. And it's the whole thing where it's like they just come here because they want to be able to degrade women and basically get away with it. Like basically feeling like they're going to push them to the limits of whatever they can do that's within their job limits, if not trying to push them farther. And it really does set them up as like really sleazy bad people, which and this is the problem, is I can't really tell, and I think that falls on the movie, is once that's established and they start doing these things, these clearly extremely immoral things, no matter what the circumstances are, no matter what direction they're coming from or what purpose they're doing it for, and if it's for a good cause for them in the long run, you do find yourself, or at least I found myself asking a lot, like, do I root for them though? Because regardless of these guys, they're still doing this kind of thing. And I don't think the movie's taking a particular approach to that. Like I was saying, when you watch Scorsese movies, and he's often accused of glorifying that sort of thing, like the gangster stuff or whatever, or the Wolf of Wall Street stuff, and he's not at all. He's showing the really horrible, terrible consequences of it if you watch the movie long enough. And I don't think this movie ever really reaches that point. I mean, sure, we get the inevitable scenes towards the end, but I mean, never feels like this movie is going against them in any form at all, like even mildly. And so that kind of leaves a bad taste in my mouth, especially the more I think about it. Um, so there's that, and the whole interview setup kind of feels inconsistent as well. The whole thing where it's Constance Wu being interviewed by Julia Stiles, which is the whole setup, and another way that they use the audio really well, in a really memorable way. But still, it's a format that you forget is there until they cut back to it, which, yeah, after a while, yeah, I don't know how effective it is if that's the case. So yeah, so I mean, there's a lot to like in here. Like I said, I like its energy and its characters, and the performances really stand out. And I can totally see why people are like all over it and like showering it with praise and all that. I wonder how much of that has to do with the expectations, because I don't think anybody expected this movie to be this type of movie. So with this much acclaim, and have this much clever stuff in it, whether it be the writing or the style or whatever. Like I said, still just a little too Scorsese, I think, to really be called unique in its approach. But yeah, it's fine. But I'm still a little baffled by the Lopez praise all the way to like awards buzz. Like she might get a gold. She'll actually most likely get a Golden Globe nomination. It might even get in for a picture, musical, or comedy, but I don't really see it going past the Globes for anybody. But I could be wrong. But yeah, it's fine. So let's end on Don't Let Go. A little movie that came out, a little thriller with David Oyelowo and Storm Reed, the girl from A Wrinkle in Time. And Blumhouse put it out, which I thought was interesting. And it's their Blumhouse Tilt studio, but still, or that portion of the studio. And the director is Jacob Aronofsky, who did Mean Creek, which obviously I love. But ever since Mean Creek, his career's gone to some really weird directors. He wrote Rings, the sequel to The Ring and The Ring 2. And he did that movie, The Details, with Tobey Maguire. And he's never really... I feel like Mean Creek was kind of a one-hit wonder thing here. But there is something in this movie. This is one of those movies that was relying heavily on its concept. And if you weren't aware of that concept, they do a really good job like opening it and setting up that concept. Where David Oyelowo is playing her uncle, Storm Reed's uncle, and she gets stranded at the movie theater and calls him up because her dad, who is a very underused Brian Tyree Henry, it's like Brian Tyree Henry is like really one of the people you really like. Whenever he's in a project now, it's like it's gonna be something great. With that in mind, he seems really wasted here. And so he's a deadbeat, her deadbeat dad that doesn't pick her up. So David Oyelowo is the uncle that comes and takes her and takes responsibility and talks to the brother. And at some point, after he has a conversation with his brother, Brian Tyree Henry, his wife, and Storm Reed are all dead in what appears to be a murder-suicide. Which basically, and this eventually leads to him, after everybody's like long dead and he's investigating into it after he's gone through his trauma, he gets a call on his cell phone from his niece from beyond the grave. And it turns out that she is still 2 weeks in the past when she's calling, so he can try to conduct her and learn exactly what happened and how he can fix it to keep them from being killed through these phone calls that are separated by this weird time thing. And so, yeah, and all of this, and talking about how well the concept is set up, is their relationship is built up pretty nicely in only 2 scenes. Like, just seeing them interact twice is enough to establish the relationship and give it enough to care. Give us enough to care about, it's clear, like, we would know how we would get a sense of how he feels when he finds her dead, and all of them. But by the time he gets the phone call from her, the movie's only been on for like 15 minutes. that's all the amount of time they used to set up this whole thing. Their relationship, the potential murder-suicide, and then the whole weird time thing. And that might seem like they're putting all their eggs in one basket really early, but it actually is impressive the way they're able to do that, because they establish it well enough that when he starts getting those phone calls, there's like equal parts mystery and emotion in it. Like, we can acknowledge, oh, it's weird, like, what exactly is going on here? Like, what's causing this to happen? This supernatural thing that he's able to talk to her while she's still in the past. But there's also the emotion we feel of he's hearing her voice again and talking to her, something that he obviously thought was never going to happen again when he saw her murdered, bloody body. So there's like a genuine emotion in there on top of the mystery of us wondering what's happening. It's like, we've got a great setup, and they've really, put this out there in a really effective way. That's a really good jumping off point for whatever the rest of this is going to be. But then it just kind of turns into another routine thriller. And it's not necessarily like the concept is new. Like the Frequency with Dennis Quaid and Jim Caviezel, I immediately thought of, which I really like, and I do think that I feel like if Frequency didn't exist, I probably would have been much more into this. Like I would have felt more about this movie than I did when I saw Frequency the first time, and you put together the concept and the ways they use it. Like the moment when he first realizes he thinks to have her do something with spray paint that'll affect what he sees in the future, and it's like the big reveal of that. I feel like would have been a much bigger deal if movies like Frequency didn't already exist. And then they add stuff in here like there's this whole thing about Internal Affairs tries to suspect him of the murders, which it does eventually get to a point where we can understand. But for pretty much for like 90% of the movie, it doesn't matter and feels like a stretch. And like it's just taking up time. So, but we do have a good cast here. So I'm at the two of them being the main selling point for getting both the mystery and the emotion across. But we've also got Michael T. Williamson as like his partner, who's like also a really close friend of his. Who does some really good stuff here. And then Alfred Molina. Alfred Molina's a little too talented and kind of too big of a name to be in the part that he plays. So he's just kind of a victim of that. I'm wondering if it's one of those cases where like they got him based solely on the concept and the other cast members. Because it's really a nothing part, so that's kind of a waste. But yeah, so after a while it just turns into that, and then once we grasp the concept and we grow to like it, they don't really do anything that we haven't seen before. And then it reaches a point midway about when they introduce another part of this concept, and it feels like a major cop-out. And once that's established that can happen, and that's something that, will happen if they do certain things, basically ends up making the rest of the movie after that totally suspenseless. Because that can just happen. And after a while it does feel more like, at the start, how I said it was so well put together, and the way they introduce everything so fast but still got their points across, it does feel like they kind of, like that was the best we got, because the rest of it is just like any other thriller you can find. Like it's something where if somebody that doesn't know the concept going in, which the movie's lack of popularity this will probably be a lot of people, and people will just catch it on like a movie channel one day, will probably like really like it, or I guess streaming, I should say. I dated myself there apparently. They'll probably be into it. Like an audience that's not as demanding, or hasn't maybe seen stuff like Frequency, or doesn't remember stuff like Frequency, may get a kick out of the concept itself and be able to just go with it as just another thriller. Like if you're just into thrillers alone, even without high concepts, then you'll be perfectly fine with this, obviously. But yeah, so the two, David Oyelowo and Storm Reid's performances do kind of bring it up a notch as to, it's a little more than it would have been without them. But still, it all just kind of feels pretty routine and just kind of presented in a fashion of, yep, here's the rest of the stuff. There's actually the very, very last shot of the movie was really funny, because it's a last shot and it all feels so abrupt. when we get to this last shot. And I was like, oh, that's a... And it lingered for a long ass time, so I was like, oh, I guess this is the last shot, but it's kind of an odd last shot. I can't imagine them cutting to black on this image, but alright, let's see if they do. And then it's like they had no idea. It's like they were thinking the same thing, like, this doesn't look like an ending shot. Let's just pan up to the sky. Then that will be where we cut to black. It's like they made the decision, like, right in that moment. It's like, this isn't our last shot. There it is. And then it cuts to black and ends. So, yeah. So I'm probably going to forget about this pretty soon. I'll probably forget about most of what I saw in the past couple of days pretty soon. So, yeah. So it's just a very underwhelming week. But a lot of people are getting a huge kick out of Hustlers. So I'm sure, you know, a lot of people will be fine with it. But I'm just sort of indifferent to pretty much everything here. So... Next week should be interesting. Ad Astra and Rambo, as well as I'll probably end up seeing Downton Abbey the week after because I'm not quite caught up on the show yet. I'm trying to finish that out before I get to the movie, so I'm not totally fucking lost. So yeah, and then I don't have a versus planned, but I guess I should plan one. So I guess I'll do that next, and then before too long we'll be doing another awards video. So. Yeah, a couple of these will probably come back up in conversation for better or worse. So until whatever the next thing is, that's it.